My name is Kent McIntosh. I'm a co-director of the Center on PBIS, and I get to moderate a panel on coaching for equity in school discipline. So this is a little bit different from the sessions that maybe you've seen before. This is going to be almost entirely Q&A time once we do some introductions throughout. So be thinking about the questions that you want to ask. I am happily joined by Maria Reina Santiago Rosario from the University of Oregon, Dr. Ruthie Pano-Simmons from the Michigan's MTS Technical Assistance Center, and Nicholas Diggs from Old Dominion University. And then we also have Ivan Polk, who's doing tech support for us, and I'll be the content moderator. I do want to start by acknowledging that Maria and I are here on traditional Kalapuya territory and are grateful for the opportunity and also want to recognize the contributions, ongoing contributions of elders past, present, and emerging in our area. So you've seen some of these slides before, but I want to lay out, especially as we have this Q&A opportunity for us to know that there might be a little bit more interactions. I think it's useful for us to lean on our good PBIS systems and be preventive. Please toss anything you like. People are already introducing themselves in chat, which is wonderful. With the over 200 or getting close to 200 people who we have here, the chat is going to fly by really fast. And so what we'd really like you to do is if you've got questions, please toss them in the polls section. So you'll see there's one question in polls for questions for speakers, and then you can populate that in there. And then that way we're able to look and see those without seeing the waterfall of everything flying by for us. You've probably all accidentally made your way out of a session. I know I've done that at least once per day for the last few days. Really easy to just come right back in. And especially because of us being interactive here, if you've got tech problems, please don't add it into the chat. Just go straight up to that help desk menu, and that'll allow us to continue the conversation, and it'll get you the support that you need. Last thing before we get started is we'd love for you to be thinking about a few guiding questions as we move forward in this work. How does this fit with our overall priorities for our PBIS or MTSS systems? What's the team that's going to be doing this work? You heard in a fantastic session on Tuesday that Dr. Pano-Simmons did looking at discussing race, that starting with a team as opposed to creating a new team can be really, really helpful. What are the things that we're going to let go of? Dr. Bradley talked about that this morning in her plenary session. And then how are we going to know whether it is working or not? So what I'm going to do here is introduce our panelists one by one. They're going to go through. So Ruthie's going to go first. Maria is going to go second, and Nick is going to go third. And what we've done is ask them to talk for 5 to 10 minutes, knowing that each of them has done coaching for equity with lots of different hats on. Sometimes it's just within PBIS. Sometimes it's in work before or outside of PBIS as an administrator. And then sometimes it's coaching for a particular equity initiative or an equity intervention. So everyone has that, but what we're really talking about is broadly, how do you engage in coaching for equity? And then if you wouldn't mind sharing 1 or 2 lessons you've learned. And what I'm going to do is I'll just introduce them through. I'll be monitoring chat, but please start thinking of those questions and stick them in the polls tab. All right. And so without further ado, I am going to introduce Dr. Ruthie Pano-Simmons.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our session. I was in the last session, and it was absolutely amazing. So that first question around how do you engage in coaching for equity? I have to start by saying that I believe that coaching for equity in education really is about coaching for social justice in education. So I embed in my coaching approach the intentional focus of cultivating a critical awareness of our social, cultural, and social political context as a nation, and how systems of oppression from that context impacts who we are, how we come to know what we know, value what we value, believe what we believe, which gets at the social conditioning that we're all impacted by from birth, and also the importance of engaging in identity work that my amazing colleagues so amazingly talked about in the last session. And so I embed and supports opportunities for ongoing critical reflection, but also to reflect on self and on systems. And so I leverage multiple frameworks to support partners when providing TA for coaching for equity. I draw from in Michigan, through our TA Center from MTSS, we have a coaching model that we use, and it's influenced by the National Implementation Research Network coaching model, also known as NERN. And then I also draw from the culturally responsive cognitive coaching model. The model that we use at our TA Center focuses on supporting partners and doing two things in particular: being able to effectively implement programs and practices and approaches to enhance student outcomes. During the pilot work that we did, I leveraged that quite a bit. And in doing so, I leveraged the tools that actually were shared in the last session. We leveraged the National TA Center's tools for the 5-point intervention approach for enhancing equity in school discipline. We used the PBIS cultural responsiveness field guide, resources for trainer and coaches. We leveraged the discipline data within the school-wide PBIS to identify and address disproportionality, which is a guide for school teams. And we also have a practice profile in Michigan. And so actually that has helped us as well. The second area that I leverage for coaching is increasing the conditions to use practices and new ways of working as intended. And that involves really working to build fluency in the practices, and also involves providing ongoing feedback on performance so that teams and individuals can gauge where they are in their process and continue to work towards their goals. The second model that I leverage is a model that is the culturally responsive cognitive coaching model. And what I like about leveraging this model with regards to coaching for equity is that it explicitly targets the desired outcomes of culturally responsive, inclusive school practices. And the strategies and planning tools that are used help coaches to maintain a focus on inclusive outcomes throughout the coaching process. And so this was critical for the PBIS equity work that we concluded in 2020, but it also continues to be a critical approach to supporting staff as I work to support, to collaborate. I work collaboratively to build internal capacity for our TA Center in Michigan to center equity in our work. And so I don't have time, of course, to unpack both of these models. So what I want to do is zero in on some of the culturally responsive cognitive coaching concepts that I've been leveraging. So I come into this work with a very strong understanding of the needs to work from a systems approach, which draws heavily from a technical stance, from engaging in intensive training and coaching supports from the organization formerly known as My Blissy. This is where I'm now currently employed, and we're now the MTSS TA Center for the state of Michigan. And so while implementing the integrated MTSS model as a building principle and as an executive director of instruction and staff development, I knew how to do those things. As I moved into my new role in RTA Center to co-lead equity pilot work, I knew from my own body of work in several years of lessons learned over the course of my career that the work really has to have a social justice approach. So this means that in addition to the very important technical aspects of the work, that we also have to coach from a contextual and critical aspect and perspective. So when we talk about the technical coaching piece, it really is coaching conversations that support addressing changes in practice. The technical conversations usually focus on a problem that teams are encountering in schools, right? They want to follow a cycle over time to identify the practices that they're going to use, to evaluate the effectiveness of those practices, to determine the change that's needed, but also to identify roles and plans and moves to monitor progress. And so when we think about the contextual coaching piece, contextual coaching conversations have really helped us to make the school culture transparent. The conversations that come from the contextual perspective also helps us to think about how do we understand the culture in order to transform educational practices. So we have to think about what's the context of the school. And the school cultures are often complex environments, right? That encompass all types of beliefs and experiences and behaviors. We're not always aware of these things. And teachers, support staff and students and administrators, they bring these in. And these factors are very strong influences in either supporting or opposing equity efforts and inclusive practices, right? So we have to address them in order to get to the changes that we want to see and to sustain those changes over time. Critical coaching dialogues that we engage in, which is a really important part of this, really, whether it's doing professional learning or data review or systems evaluations or implementation of action plans or practices, or just having the needed conversations to extend learning, have to examine power and privilege, right? And ask questions around who's benefiting from the way things are, who's benefiting from those school practices, and how to bring students who have been marginalized into the center of the school culture. So as I work to support teams on their journeys towards transformation and inclusive practices, we're always collectively and consciously working to engage in critical dialogues to identify and address inequities in the schools that we're working in to support. And so my role in this process really is to facilitate deeper reflection, prompts for broadening awareness, and support teams in identifying goals, working towards to work towards those goals. And so a couple of lessons learned, and there's so many, it's like, which ones do you share? But the two that I want to share, one is really the importance of naming educational inequities in the work. Because we often focus on like student outcomes. And while that's important, we often miss opportunities to understand the systemic inequities that may exist. Look at me, I'm getting all tongue-tied in schools that may actually be impacting how students are learning and how teachers are teaching. So what is it about our people practices and policies that's contributing to those systemic inequities? Really getting teams to think about that, getting teams to name those inequities really allows them to focus on the inadequacies in their systems rather than pathologizing students and attempting to fix them, which leads to my second lesson learned. My second lesson learned really has been serving as a critical friend, but also decentering myself as the expert. Serving as a critical friend really, and decentering myself as the expert. I have expertise, but so does the team that I'm supporting. And so how do we leverage the collective areas of expertise to engage in the work really is important. And so these interconnected practices really have been an ongoing necessity for leading and learning side by side with teams that I support and work with, and with my colleagues at our TA Center as we engage in our work. And so what is a critical friend? Really quickly as I close, a critical friend really can be defined as a trusted person who's going to ask provocative questions, who's going to provide data to be examined through like another lens, and offer critiques of a person's work as a friend. A critical friend takes the time to fully understand the context of the work presented and the outcomes that the person or the group is really working towards, and is an advocate of the success of that work. And so some of the characteristics of a critical friend is to constantly engage in cultivating critical awareness and consciousness, to be supportive, to be a thought partner, to extend grace, to be vulnerable, share their own missteps. I've shared a lot of my own missteps along the way, my own journey, to be collaborative and to promote accountability, but also to continuously position oneself as a learner. And so these are things I constantly work to have and to make sure that I'm supporting others as I'm learning. So those are some of the lessons that I have learned.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruthie, for sharing not only how you do it and those frameworks that you use, but also some really good lessons learned. So excited about your questions coming up. All right, next I'm going to introduce Maria. Dr. Santiago Rosario is going to share 5 to 10 minutes on her approach to coaching.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Kent. And thank you, Ruthie, for what you've shared. And I think you cover like so many wonderful lessons that you've learned and approaches to equity that I might echo a bit and expand upon with some of my examples as well. I am an early career professional. I've been trained as a school psychologist. I have the problem-solving model ingrained in my system, and I've been trained on PBIS as the lens to approach systems. As you've heard in other pieces of this conference, is like there's a lot that can be embedded, and we can use like the refrigerator magnet, like Dr. Rose mentioned earlier, to bring folks back to what our priorities are and focus on the students. So that definitely is the foundation of my work. I've served in the role of school level coach for PBIS and MTSS systems, and at the district level as well. And more recently, providing technical assistance at the state level. And my approach as a coach or as a TA provider looks different across those experiences. Thinking back to my time more connected directly with the families, the students, and the in-school personnel that is living the everyday. My role as a coach was to understand that context, remember like who am I and other people that I'm listening to, who am I representing and I'm bringing to the table just by me being here. And by talking to so many that I had access to help the team come to an agreement on what to prioritize and continue working throughout like their year. Part of that work in the coaching for equity, even though part of it is, I think at one layer is remembering the best practices pieces to it and helping the individuals that are internal coaches and are building the capacity of those folks in there, helping them develop systems that work for them to expand this. So just to bring an example of coaching for equity, if my schools that I work with were not using Swiss, so they don't have that technology available to instantly be able to see racial disparities in the school discipline. So looking for resources, what's out there that might help me get to that information was one way that I was able to coach for equity, knowing that there were issues that families were talking about or internal folks were talking about, helped me keep those things on the agenda, either at the school or at the district level, so that there was an ongoing conversation, even if the steps that team would be able to take were like the smallest thing, but in the right direction. So now with my current work, I provide support to school level teams and their training of staff on different approaches to, or different strategies to engage students, build better relationships preventatively, while also teaching or talking about, having a conversation about implicit biases, how does that affect our decisions in our schools, and specifically our practices and our instructional practices in everyday, understanding the VDP framework that you might have heard throughout parts of this conferences. That's also how I've been engaging coaching for equity right now. So if I gotta narrow this to one or two lessons that I've learned so far, sometimes one would be, the first thing that comes to mind is like not losing like the north of that whomever you're coaching, you know, like as you're establishing that relationships, you got to understand what are we sharing in common. That got to be explicit. Like, who are we supporting and doing this effort for, and keeping that in mind, because as you know better than most of us, in your own context, you're your expert, you're gonna face different barriers, and you got to remember that at points when the energy fuel is running low. And yeah, I would say that one. And just, you got to do a lot of learning, as Ruthie was mentioning. I'm definitely not an expert. I have no issue saying that about many things. And that has helped me stay open to want to access resources, want to understand things that are going on from the viewpoint of the same folks that we're trying to help, the same populations that have been marginalized or oppressed in different ways. So that lesson has helped me be able to bring into my training and my coaching the work that I do to facilitate like learning a strategy. And I would say that's about it. I had another thing that came to mind and it like left as I was saying that last piece. So I might come to it with one of the questions.
We've got time, so that'll work. I think you shared a lot, Maria, especially thinking about how do we reach out and elevate voice for those who don't have voice in our systems and families, as you were describing. And at the same time, I think you also talked about proactively identifying barriers ahead of time so that you're ready for them and not kind of caught off guard and kind of have to respond right in the moment. So thank you for that, Maria. All right, and I'm going to introduce Nick, and Nick, go ahead. It's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Kent. So I'm Nicholas Diggs, and I've had the opportunity to kind of serve at a lot of different roles in this process. And so my formative experiences, I guess, around coaching for equity came when I was a classroom teacher and a building level coach of a PBIS team. And we were working on aligning and integrating some of our equity initiatives into that systems work and systems change. Currently in my role as a VTSS systems coach, I work with a wonderful team in the state of Virginia as part of an equity work group where we're doing a lot of developing content for training of division level teams across the state. And then there are several divisions that I work directly with and support them and schools within those divisions in implementing division specific and school specific equity efforts and initiatives. I think Ruthie touched a lot on kind of some of the coaching models that I tend to use in terms of my approach, as far as like NERN's coaching model for the way in which we coach. I rely heavily on VTSS's kind of data-informed decision-making process as an anchor to the way in which we engage in conversations around equity. And that'll be one of the takeaways that I'll touch on in just a minute, as far as the importance of data and the way in which we engage in equity work and work with others. I have a real tendency to focus on systems level work when dealing with equity and engaging in conversations about equity and thinking about problem solving for solutions. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that disproportionate outcomes are not the result of individual anomalies, right? And so if we're talking about disproportionality, then we're talking about things that are systemic, and we have to like come to that understanding in order to figure out how to progress in a meaningful way for change. And then thinking about how do we analyze problems, not just by drilling down to figure out specifically what's going on, but also by stepping back. Because one of the things is when we're thinking about and looking at systems, we have to be able to take that balcony view as well. and say, okay, so this is the data point that is kind of popping for us, and we need to solve that problem, but is that a symptomatic indicator of a larger systemic issue that's at play? And that is really important, again, when we're thinking about equitable outcomes and the systems that are creating some of those inequities that are being experienced by different members of the community, the school community, and the broader community. As part of that work, I really focus on trying to building an understanding for identity, both of the individual, the practitioner themselves, the identities of the students and families that are a part of that school community, and the kind of collective identity of the community in which that school or school system is situated. And then understanding with that identity, the ways in which it impacts or maintains the systems that are in place, but also the ways that it might influence the decision-making and problem-solving process, which leads, I guess, to the other one of my takeaways, which is the importance of voice and lifting up the voice of all stakeholders. Because oftentimes what we find is that we might have a team that is representative of the staff, right, within a school or within a division, but it's not necessarily inclusive or representative of the broader community or the student and families that are being served by those schools. And so thinking about ways in which to engage meaningfully and substantively those voices into the conversation, and not just at the beginning of the conversation, but throughout the process. And so there are a couple of divisions that I'm working with really closely right now on that, right? So how do we engage them in the beginning of the process, and then continually going back and continuing the conversation so that all those voices are a part of the decision-making and problem-solving process, so that we get to a place where we minimize some of the blind spots that we might have and the ways in which we think about creative solutions to some of the problems that have resulted from the ways in which systems are currently structured. So again, my takeaways really quickly, because I want to give you all time for questions, is number one, anchor all of your work and discussion in data. And not just to think about data as student outcome data alone, but to also think about things like climate surveys. Think about things like, do we have opportunities to engage students and families in focus groups, right? Do we have opportunities to engage staff, support staff, administrators in focus groups? Looking at data around things like participation and engagement rates, right? What does this tell us about the story or narrative around what access is, and or the inclusivity and welcomingness of the environments in which we're asking students to lean into and participate, right? And so there's a story to be told there, and thinking about all of that data collectively when we speak about data and have these conversations about the story that it tells. Again, like I said, uplifting those stakeholder voices throughout the process. And then lastly, as a coach, I think it's really important that you focus on creating an enabling context in order for the equity work to occur. There has to be a sense of trust and safety within that environment for these conversations to occur in a way that is honest and meaningful. And that's the only way that you will get the diversity of perspectives and understanding that's necessary in order to develop truly collective solutions that benefit all members of that community. And so I think that's the other really important piece, is building, again, that enabling context. So Ken, I'll turn things back over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Nicholas. Love the focus on voice, love the focus on data and expanding our view of data, and then working within the existing systems that are there is a really nice way in, as opposed to trying to create something new and different that feels like something else that they have to put on their plate, some new coach they have to interact with, and so on. So that's wonderful. I know I'm really excited about this opportunity to interact. Just to prime everybody for it, we got over 250 people right here, which is wonderful. So there won't be a chance to get called on for if you're raising your hand. The best way to do that, you can go right into the polls tab and you can ask a question. You can also upvote a question too. So you can stick your, you can click on that little thumb, and that'll be the way that we prioritize the time through. So what I'm going to do, if it's all right, is I'm just going to start with our top vote. Oh my gosh, the votes are going up as I speak. And then we're just going to keep opening it up for everybody. Wow, you were all a very responsive group. I thought I was just talking to my computer. So question number one is, what are some promising strategies for building rapport with school personnel? That'll be the first one. And feel free to unmute, and we'll all look at who's unmuting so we don't talk over each other.
Okay, so some of the things that I've learned, I think, through the work, and again, learning ongoing, is to start by honoring work. So like in our work here in Michigan, we went into schools and we were having to build relationships somewhat out of thin air, right? So we really wanted to, and we learned this not in year one, we learned it through the course of the process, honoring the existing work that teams are engaging in and that staff's engaging in. So we really had to understand the context of our partners, and then to think about what are the things that they are doing, and then coming in and demonstrating that we understand some of the things that they're engaging in and celebrating that and highlighting it, and then looking to, to think about how to build on it. Going in and doing that, let people know we weren't coming in because I don't think adults are to be fixed either. We're coming in to learn together and grow together. One of the things that really helped when we were doing work around implicit bias was operationalizing the word implicit itself. Just really taking time to unpack. When we say implicit, we mean unintentional. We're not aware, so that our colleagues wouldn't feel like we were coming in and pointing a finger. Also, having teams look at some of the history of our country and not going right into their data, so that we could kind of create some awareness around why we would be looking at that data, and helping our teams understand that we have inherited these systems of oppression, and that it's not any one person's fault, but that we have a really amazing opportunity to change some of those ways. And then being vulnerable, that was a big one. Being vulnerable and sharing some of our own missteps, some of our own issues of bias, especially being a Black woman standing often in a space full of amazing white colleagues. Being able to share my own bias allowed for my colleagues to feel like, wow, if she is making mistakes, we or has her story, we have our stories too. And that really allowed us to build some relationships. And then being prepared when you come in, because I think teams want to feel productive and feel like they're getting things accomplished. So really being prepared and making sure that when you show up, that you are ready to go and support the work, and then taking their lead in many of the steps, so that it doesn't feel like you're coming in and telling someone what to do, but you're coming in and working alongside. And I remember at one of the high schools in our first PL, this is the last thing I'll say about this, we were so nervous because we knew the learning was gonna be challenging. And one of the staff members went and brought both myself and my colleague that were doing this work, their high school jackets with the letter. It was so powerful. So we tried to wear those when we went back, so that we could be a part of the community as much as possible. And so those are some things that we learned and some things that we felt like were helpful.
Yeah, so I would echo a lot of that. I think some of the things that I found to be really helpful in building that rapport is acknowledging their expertise, right? They are oftentimes members of the communities that they are serving. They are in those schools, in those school districts or divisions. And so just acknowledging that they are the experts, and that, I, as an external coach, am coming in to support them, right? I don't have that same level of understanding of their, community culture. Honoring their experiences, both collectively and individually, I think is a really important piece of building rapport with them, and modeling the practice that you want to see in terms of the approach in which they're going to engage others throughout the process of moving towards more equitable outcomes. And then acting as a partner in the learning, right? So as they begin to kind of unpack their data and dive into better understanding what their learning environments are like, what the experiences of the various members of their school communities are as they come into those buildings and facilities on a daily basis are, that you are there beside them, right? And you are learning and operating from an inquisitive mindset as well, right alongside them, and being a partner in that part of the work. And then I think the last thing that I would offer is that structured work around identity and better, deeper understandings of personal identity is another opportunity to kind of build that rapport as well. Emphasis on structure, right? That you have a plan to how that process is going to occur. But to Ruthie's point about, as part of that, being personally vulnerable and sharing your own experiences and being willing to connect in that way is really important too, in building those bonds and connections.
Yes, and I'm pretty much going to be echoing here, but one thing that I like to remind myself as I'm coming in to provide these trainings and bring up topics that could be or not controversial in like that space, starting with like rejecting that false dichotomy of like, you're either a good person or a bad person here, and really emphasizing on the systems and the structures. And in that journey that you're bringing folks in with you, starting with by defining things like Ruthie mentioned, using examples that might be less intimidating. I think that that's definitely been helpful. So if we're talking about implicit bias, we might know if there were conversations before with people from like district, or if there are issues around like race specifically, like you might use a lot of examples and start with others that might not be specific to racial bias before you start opening that can of worms and talking more directly about what might be happening in that particular place. Not being afraid to ask follow-up questions. I think that in that context, while like honoring the person and what they're bringing in, I think tapping into respecting them individually and as a collective. Sometimes folks might say things in a training that you have a diverse group of folks, so you can't just like pretend you didn't hear anything when things are occurring, like statements are said. So allowing folks to unpack that. So asking those questions, what they mean by it, not assuming anything. So really being strategic with the questioning. So you're also really engaging them. You're that person that might keep them engaged in that moment, while also processing what's going on with the group through the opportunity to hear more.
Those are great points, Maria. And it just brings us back to this idea of connections. And, in my mind, a lot of it is having rapport with the person, hopefully before you're jumping straight into the specific equity work. And that's why I think, what Nicholas you were talking about, this whole idea of doing it within existing systems. So it's not like now we're bringing in this outside person who's going to look at our division or district and say, we are bad people. Instead, if it comes from the coach, from the trainer, from the district coordinator who has already kind of made themselves known, have been able to help people with like just even really basic stuff, even if it's just sort of like help prep the agenda for the next meeting. Like we found that doing those really mundane things as a coach is a great way to build those effective practices instead of just coming in and saying, hey, let's look at what we're doing wrong. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our second one here, and this one is very highly rated. How best should we engage in this work when the most vocal part of your community is loudly against it? I see a lot of muting on. I think we've got lots of thoughts and ideas, but Nicholas, go ahead.
All right, I'll be brave and step out there. So I think I'll reiterate and echo something that I said in the beginning, which is anchor your work and your discussions in the data. I think that the first thing here is, if this is a thing that you know in advance, then be proactive in your approach to it. And keep in mind that those members of the community are stakeholders too. So I'm working with a division right now that has had a history that is deeply rooted even in its formation in segregation. And they are trying to work through how to engage the broader community and their schools in a conversation about racial equity. And so as part of that process, one of the things that we are being very intentional about is how to cast a really wide net and engage known groups of community stakeholders and partners that have a high likelihood to be resistant to this work, and engage them on the front end in terms of identifying, the things that are meaningful to them about the way in which this work proceeds, sharing with them the data, the story that the data tells, the experiences of other members of the community who they may not necessarily interact with on a regular basis, so that we are building some common understanding and a common rationale for moving forward with these efforts, right? To produce better outcomes for all students that are being served by those schools. And so again, if you haven't, taken the plunge into the building level work yet, then being proactive, I think, in engaging their stakeholders is one of the things that I would recommend. If you have, then still reach out, engage those stakeholders when possible, and focus on the data and the story that it tells. I find myself often reminding myself and coaching others, don't debate intent, right? If we can center the conversation on the impact and the truth of the experiences and outcomes that are being experienced, and the need to move those data points, then it removes some of the resistance, not all of it, but some of it, and it reshapes the conversation and provides new pathways for how you can partner to move forward.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Nick, I was thinking, I think very similar to that, the last piece you're talking, just finding that commonality of what you are caring about and why you're there for. So like you're saying, focusing on the impact that whatever particular problem you're tackling has on the students and the families that you're serving through by coaching their teams, and keeping that and providing like that rationale and intentionality at the beginning when having these conversations. I think when I've seen this happen, it's tough to see folks resist it. Like when you're talking about the student outcomes, like going against wanting that kind of shifts the conversation in my experience.
I really just want to reiterate something that Nick said, and that is leaning into those that we might want to shy away from, right? So like a lot of times, and I saw this working at the district level, when we were going through any type of large system, a second order change, when there was a lot of resistance, you tend to see people not wanting to lean into the conversations with those who are like loudly opposing, and sometimes being able to cross those lines and have conversations, asking questions around, what are your real concerns? What are the reasons, that you feel the way you feel? Because Nick, you said something so powerful. It's a community, and people that oppose are also part of the community. And I have some real radical thoughts about some of that. But what I like about what you said was being able to move towards bringing people into the conversation to move forward collectively. But also keeping in mind, you said this too, so I'm just reiterating something that you said, and that is letting the data tell a story about where we are as a community and where we need to go. And I love how the second day included student voice, because that's powerful. How can you watch that and then continue to want to oppose without at least thinking about what it is that our young people are saying to us, and how can we take that as an opportunity to be empowered to make a difference. So I really appreciated that. And at the end of the day, we're all, trying to be nice and get along, but we also have to take a stand sometimes and say what's right and what's wrong and what we're going to move forward and do. And so finding ways to thoughtfully keep that at the forefront of the conversation, that kids are hurting. So we can't let kids fall off while we're trying to figure it out. We have to stay committed to doing what's best for all kids. And if our data tells us that we're not serving all of our kids well, then we have to act on that. And that's not an easy conversation, but it's one that has to be kept in front.
I love that. I love that from all of you. And I think that don't debate intent idea is really powerful in the sense of we might have lots of different hypotheses for why those disparities exist. And, I really like the idea if somebody is saying that our school systems are built to marginalize and exclude BIPOC students, we can go with that. If somebody says, like a societal description of saying, oh, well, this is poverty or this is upbringing or something like that, I personally, and people have different ways of doing it, I personally don't always dispute that right away. I often say, well, okay, what is it that we're going to do in our schools to actually help students come in and have that equal opportunity? And it just so happens that both of those very different perspectives lean us toward how do we change our schools and how do we make them more instructive and how do we make them less exclusionary. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a controversial way. I realize that I have some privilege in being able to do and say that in a way. And that's why I think it's so helpful for us to have, and to describe just specifically diversity in our coaching and training individuals as well.
Kent, you made me think of something, so I'll say this really quick. We wouldn't be where we are as a nation if we didn't keep, move things forward. Like the best change comes through struggle, right? And so I just appreciate the idea of all the things that were said, but also trying to figure out how to collectively move forward and not let, I don't know if the word threat is the right word, but pushback make us go backwards, because we didn't get to where we are today in 2021 by not being willing to push through some of the struggle and take certain stands in the struggle. So that does become, it is a part of the work as well, meaning it may, we may be unpopular, we may be unliked, but what is our purpose? Why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? And I think that becomes a part of it as well.
Great. This is like the perfect segue into the next upvoted question, which is, what are your best tips for coaching to break through white fragility? Go for it, Ruthie.
Okay, so I do not have nearly enough answers, but one thing that we leveraged that was really helpful was the idea of pre-correct. And so centering learning around literature that allows us to unpack fragility as a pre-correct, we found that to be very useful. In particular, we did leverage Robin DiAngelo's work in multiple forms. And we were very explicit that it was going to serve as a pre-correct, and leveraged her content to unpack why it would be a pre-correct. And that was really helpful as we read through the article and supporting literature. It allowed for us to talk through conversations that people hadn't had before, and then we could come back to it. And we also leveraged Singleton and Linton's engaging in courageous conversations, which allowed for us to name that this is uncomfortable work, that this is going to, make us feel things, think things, and that is okay, but how we engage becomes important. So those are really helpful. I know we all know about those now. And then another thing that really was helpful was to be honest and graceful. So as we built relationships with our colleagues if deficit language is being used, because we all are guilty of it, we all use deficit language, even when we're aiming to use asset-based language. As a coach, I called it. And I didn't call it in a way that was harmful or ugly. I tried to find a light and fun way to restate the statement using asset language. And then after building rapport and trust, being able to give language and then provide professional learning around to build fluency for using the asset language. And then again, going back to that critical friendship piece, being able to have those conversations when they're the hardest, but doing it in a loving way, doing it in a way that keeps a person's integrity intact. Sometimes it might be a one-on-one. So sometimes it's not in the room where everyone is when it happens, but it's a phone call or an email or a Zoom or follow-up afterwards to set some time to the side to talk about it. So those were some of the ways to do that, and just constantly just nudging through the learning and the conversations was just really helpful. But the pre-correct we found was most helpful for us.
I don't know that I have a great answer, but in thinking of how to coach to break through white fragility as a coach for equity of color. I have the advantage of sharing that space with the persons when we're having the conversation, and sometimes just being and speaking your truth in those spaces. And like I've said before, having conversations that allow engagement and more conversation, just to mention an example without giving too many details, of a perspective that was shared when watching a video, where the point of the video is to spark conversations of how people are perceiving two persons in a park, and one is white, one is black, and that sparks different conversations. And something that was shared, kind of you could hear a pin drop after a statement. And in that moment, I was able to relate and to share my personal experience and personal experiences after, though, I honored their truth. And in reflecting upon that, if I were to be in that same moment or in a similar moment, I will ask the group for what would be another way that we could interpret this example, what was shared, and allow for more group conversation around that. So also show yourself some grace, because you can reflect and come back to it with different interactions.
Yeah, those are great responses. And I put in the chat what the video you were describing, Maria, just if people want to use it. I know that it does get used because it's a particularly useful and powerful one. I would say from my perspective, going back to what Ruthie described about pre-correction is really nice. And then also normalizing. So me as a white guy, it's actually super useful, I think, for the audience, for them to hear my experience. And so a lot of times I'll say, hey, when I first saw this slide, I thought, no way, that's not me, or it couldn't be like that, or that that video of the bicycle thief, I say, yeah, my first thought was, and then I thought a little bit further. And I think what you're doing is you're able to build this connection that fragility is something that is your friend, because it's helping you realize where you're going and where you need to be. We don't want to tell people that their feelings are not valid. We want to actually encourage people to keep feeling it and not shy away from the work. And that's been a helpful thing for me.
So quickly, 3 things you made me think of, Ken, as you all were sharing. One is showing vulnerability. I could share other ways in which I had biases and how I had to work through those. I have fragility too in this work. And so being honest and vulnerable, sharing some of my own fragility issues that I'm working through, modeled. And that was powerful. Another thing that I learned as administrators shared their vulnerability, being a part of the process, that also helped others to feel more, vulnerable and to talk. Also helping people understand yet again that we did not create these systems of oppression, we inherited them. So there's no finger pointing. So we now have the opportunity to leverage what we're learning to disrupt some of these. And then acknowledging that we're all we're working collectively, but we're all on individual journeys. So it's okay to be exactly where you are right now, as long as you don't stay there. So those kinds of things really help to humanize the work as well, and to allow people to be where they are while moving towards where they're trying to go.
Very well said. Very well said. All right, we're going to move on to another question here. And I will say, I'll actually just comment on that a little bit. Some of you, if you've been looking, if you're in states where maybe there's been some divisive topics being banned, one of them is somebody should not feel shame because of their ancestors' behavior. And I think a lot of us in doing this work don't actually feel like that's not an effective intervention to induce shame for that, but it's actually really helpful in terms of looking at the history to be able to say, this is why we're seeing the patterns that we see right now. And you don't have to hold responsibility for it to see that it is the effect or the consequence of prior behavior. And if we can recognize that, that can be a helpful way of looking at it. All right, next question up here. And thank you for placing this in here. So I'm actually going to prime them in the chat. How do you avoid burnout as a BIPOC educator? So that's Black, Indigenous, or person of color educator, working in a system that is at best skeptical of cultural discussions and at worst outright defiant toward them. What advice would you give an educator in this situation?
Did you put that question in chat, Ken?
Yes, yeah, I put it right in chat, but everybody is going at it right now. So I will stick it in again right here as well. But as how do you avoid burnout as a BIPOC educator, working in a system that is at best skeptical of cultural discussions and at worst outright defiant toward them? What advice would you give an educator?
I kind of, you know what, whatever, in the sense that community, for me as community, what can you do? You know, like BIPOC people don't have the choice of experiencing anything different if you start like avoiding or stop interacting, or, you know, and sometimes you gotta rely in your community to re-energize, like not lose perspective, to cherish yourself and remind yourself of your own value and why what you do or are supposed to do is important. Because I know when I'm in that like sitting by that table, it's not anger, but it's like a spark that makes me focus on even advocating for that like more. So that helps me. Advocating, thinking of whom I'm advocating for, really also helps me when I'm in that table to be able to have that conversation when I'm feeling at my most burnout.
Yeah, I think for me, I lean heavily into wellness practices as a means of, I guess, supporting myself. And I think it is one of the things that in my coaching work in general, I try and advocate for other coaches, because I find that burden bearing is a thing that happens, you know, as a coach, whether it is around equity work or any other work where you're, you know, coaching and supporting individuals, is that because you become invested in helping support them through their problems, that you begin to take on, you know, some of that stress. I think as a person of color, it is rough sometimes engaging in some of these equity conversations, particularly when there are things that are activating on a personal level, right? Whether it be remarks that are made, or, you know, current events either within a division or on a national or local level, that make it tougher to you know, be resilient and show up as your best self on, you know, any given day. And so I think that there's also a level of self-awareness that is required when engaging in this work, and being honest with yourself about when it is becoming too heavy. One of the benefits of the way we're structured in Virginia is that we tend to coach in dyads and triads. And so relying on your partners and or your allies, right, in any educational setting that you might be working in, I think is another practice that I would definitely suggest to you, that if you're not doing, be more willing to engage in, right, is to find that team of people, your support system, and be willing to rely on them and allow them to help support you and hold you up in those moments where things are too tough for you to, you know, kind of carry on your own. But that is an important part of doing any of this work successfully, is that you are only as much a benefit to anyone else as the way in which you show up. And if you don't show up, you know, whole and able to engage fully, then you're not doing yourself any favors or those that you're trying to serve in that moment.
Thank you for that. Those are all, I mean, really helpful. And so I'll just add, because a lot of those were things that I was thinking about. I want to reiterate something that Nick said, though, because we all nod at it, but we don't do a very good job of it. We do have to think about our mental, emotional, physical, spiritual well-being in this work. So we have to think about as individuals, how do we make sure we're caring for those things ongoing? How do we monitor where we are as we're working? I'm always, there are 3 areas I check on when I'm working: sense of self, sense of purpose, and sense of well-being. And if I can't say yes to all of those, then I have to step back and think about what is making me feel that way and how do I address that. Sometimes it's having real honest conversations with colleagues and friends about where I am, because people don't always know that. And then other times it's me checking to see why am I in that kind of space. The other thing that I've learned in this process is that it's not my job to change people's hearts and minds. It is my job to support learning and growing, as I'm also learning and growing. And so if I take it on like it's my job to make it all okay, I'm gonna burn out. And so how do we galvanize the community to build and galvanize whoever those are that are willing to do the work to be a part of the work, so that it's a shared experience, shared responsibility, ability, like Nick was saying. And then there was one other. I personally had to turn the news off. I actually had to turn it off because it was impacting ways in which I was showing up. And then there was an expectation about what was gonna happen when I showed up. And then I learned that I had to kind of be careful not to take in so much of the information that's being out there that it just really was harmful to me. And so those are ways in which I have worked to try to care for myself. But really, like at the end of this session, I'm getting on my motorcycle. It's like 50 degrees in Michigan, and I'm going for a long ride. Throttle therapy is the best for me. So what are the things that you love that you do that helps you to decompress and to reflect and to refresh, and then to do those things? But I think also a lot of the things we've talked about, those things also help over time as more people come on board to support doing the work.
Absolutely. And I think creating that space is something that's so important for white allies to be able to do. So be the person who calls out the strange statements, be the person who points out microaggressions, be the person who points out systems problems instead of individual staff or student problems. I think that part is huge, and but do it in a way that doesn't center, or I try to do it in a way that doesn't center me and my needs in it, you know, where I can call it and say, I'm going to surface this to the table so that it's not on the, you know, BIPOC staff member to be able to do it or to mess with it, and recognize I do not have anything near all of the solutions. And Juliana talked about creating affinity spaces. You know, I'll be really honest, when I hear the term affinity spaces, there's a little bit of like my white fragility pops up a little bit, like, oh, I can't be in on helping out. I can't be in on fixing that. And so I think it's really good for us to recognize and be able to, that those spaces are really, really helpful. And just recognize that any conversation about equity, when you know, I as a white person, I'm really excited to bring it up. It is absolutely potentially traumatizing for my BIPOC colleagues, even if it goes well, you know, right? And so I think it's useful for us to recognize that.
Ken, really quickly, I know our time is wrapping up, but I want to specifically look in the camera and reiterate what you just said, and that is to my white colleagues, yes, we need, I'm speaking from a member of the BIPOC community, we need your voice. And when you speak up, it really does help. So I want to reiterate what Kent just said, because that has been very helpful for me personally when my colleagues speak up. My white colleagues speak up and they name and call out things. And we're not talking about calling out things to be hurtful to other people, but it really does help when that happens. So I really want to just say that if you're at that table and you're seeing those things, being able to call those out really does make a huge difference. There's an article out there, I'll try to find it and share it. And it says, your Black colleagues are not okay at work. And that article was really powerful because it, like when I read it, I was like, this is exactly how I'm feeling right now, especially in the height of things that were going on last year. And to have colleagues show up and speak out and not be afraid to highlight things that we need to give attention to in the culture of the work that we're engaging in, it's a critical part. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
Thanks so much, Ruthie, and thank you for sharing and giving that message. All right, so I think we got time for one more question here, and this was the highest rated question, or the highest rated left question. When working with a consultant and there's a clear lack of readiness, what do you recommend as the approach? So what is your, you know, what I have been, people have told and I've pulled up, what is the thin edge of the wedge? What is the thing you lead with when you're thinking the very first steps here? I'll start out a little bit. One of the things that I look at is having the conversation in small groups is really helpful, and having the conversation with a few people who you think would be allies, accomplices, workers in the work is extremely helpful. We have this real vision that, you know, in this day and age, any parent can be upset about any equity conversation, even handled masterfully. And so to be able to prepare administrators ahead of time and have their support and have their conversations so that they're able to give you cover as opposed to, you know, hang you out, I think is something that's really important. Don't go in alone. Figure out who are the people who are naturally in there, who want to do the equity work, who are interested in doing it. Right, and Ruthie.
I'm hoping I'm looking at the question in chat. I was trying to pull some articles, but one thing I learned from the equity pilot work we did here in Michigan was, alongside of centering equity, we were also shoring up PBIS. So continuing to strengthen PBIS systems and to norm around how we're defining the different categories for behavior, how making sure the data is clean. Those are all ways that really were helpful before we could even really get into the equity work deeply. And then another thing that was really helpful was just starting with something that as small as when you're looking and you're already engaging in your data review, just starting to disaggregate the data to understand what's happening. It seems like a small step, but then it can begin to grow. And the tools that the team in the previous session shared from the National PBIS TA Center, they really do provide step-by-step approach and thoughts around how to get started. That then you can look at disaggregated data and then just begin to have conversations about what you're seeing as a natural part of what you're already doing. Because I think a part of the challenge is people feel like not yet another thing. And so when you can see that you can do this in the existing systems and structures that you're working in, then it's like, okay, we're gonna this month when we look at our data, we're gonna disaggregate it and just start to understand what are we seeing around that, and using those guides to kind of help. And I love the culturally responsive field guide, because then you can use that if you're already looking at your TFI data, your tier fidelity inventory data, for those of you who may be using that. You could, one small step. I mean, a small step can be small, but it's like a rock in the water. It can create a ripple effect that gets larger and larger over time. So that would be something that I would say would be helpful. And then one other thing I would say is sometimes we want to go right to the data because we're driven to look at data in our work, but sometimes just having professional learning that is creating an awareness about the environments that we're living in and the conditions that inform how we're showing up. Then when people do look at data, they're already starting to have a critical filter to ask questions themselves, rather than being on defense when they look at the data because they didn't have the opportunity to cultivate and build an awareness of some of these systemic inequities that we have inherited.
Yeah, what comes to my mind is getting input from all your stakeholders and kind of like Ken mentioned, small groups do help with that, with having those conversations. And I think of engaging in the questioning with your teachers, with your parents, with your students, and using the tools that are available to you to allow for these groups to actively be able to provide input, like a walkthrough tool. I love doing walkthroughs with groups of folks, and they're looking at different things in their schools because it allows them to actively participate in another way. And that information that's getting gathered can help with building that readiness that's needed.
Yeah, I know we're short on time. So the last thing that I would add is document the story, right? Collect the data, disaggregate the data, think about those expanded data points that I talked about at the beginning, and look at those as part of the work. And then decision rules is often an area that I think is a soft target. Like if we have a lot of decision rules set up that create barriers and inequities within our system by design that can be adjusted with much less resistance and pushback within organizations I've found in the schools and divisions and districts that I've partnered with in this work. And so that may be a place to start, right? Is how do we increase access and look at, analyze, and adjust our decision rules to be more inclusive.
Fantastic. Thank you. And those are great ways to kind of wrap this up, and really specific points, but also within the systems approaches. Please join me. I know you're doing this in chat in thanking our panel. That was really, really wonderful. I certainly hope you'll be able to catch the videos here in Pathable and the chat in Pathable. Then it'll show up on pbis.org. Please fill out your evaluation. And if you want to get more and more learning, there's going to be a wonderful session in half an hour on policy related to PBIS, school discipline, and equity coming up that Dr. Amber Green is going to be leading. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your conference.